major controversy in Formula One. Now, Max Verstappen has been crowned, at the moment, your 2021 Formula One World Driving Champion. However, major controversy throughout the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix has cast a shadow across the racing world, and it appears that if Mercedes has its way, this result will be challenged and possibly overturned in the courts. It's a historic day in auto racing. Let's talk about it. So, welcome to my channel where we talk about racing. And certainly, I felt that this day is a special day and one that I really need to talk about. Perhaps infamous would be a better word. But one thing that I have thought throughout this day, really during the race and since it is concluded, is that this is a race that we will be talking about for not only years but decades to come. The comparison between this and the Suzuka races of 89 and 90, in which Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost got together a couple of times and controversy ensued, and certainly there were battles after the fact in multiple versions of delegation to ultimately settle those disputes. You look at like the Schumacher and Hill 1994 World Championship, or later Schumacher and Villeneuve, in which cars came to blows at points. And that didn't necessarily happen today, but several things happened that really had been building throughout the Formula One season, and ultimately there are real questions that need to be answered, in my opinion, on the race control side of things in Formula One. But I think the real winner today was Netflix, because, you know, this is a controversial opinion, I guess, but Max Verstappen shares it, and he's the world champion, at least for now, so I feel pretty confident in sharing it. But the Drive to Survive Netflix show, it's been very good for the sport, obviously, but the problem with it is that it's got quite a bit of fake drama, and ultimately the fake drama became reality really today, but also if you look back to the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix as well. I would say we had two races in a row that were quite farcical. A lot of things happening that, quite frankly, shouldn't be happening at the pinnacle of the sport. Alleged pinnacle of the sport anyway, allegedly. So let's talk about a few key points throughout this race, because, you know, I kind of feel like I need to get my thoughts out about this at the time, because as history, like I mentioned, goes on, our perspectives are going to change on this event, but I think it's important to kind of have it on record what I'm feeling right now. So the first point is the Lewis Hamilton corner cut on lap 1, and that's what I'm going to call it. And ultimately, by the way, Race Control did see it as a corner cut. They just determined, which I disagreed with, and several other experts, Martin Brundle and others included in that, that the time that Lewis Hamilton gave back did not justify full throttling a chicane. And ultimately, and I felt this after Saudi Arabia, well, let's face it, Formula One, if you watch Formula One really in the Herman Tilke era, you have felt this probably for a while, and it is that stewards are making decisions that ultimately wouldn't need to be made if there was just some sort of a punishment for going off of the road. A real punishment, not one that's determined by the stewards. Gravel traps. I know, I suggested it kind of early. I've suggested it since, kind of really publicly since the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, is that some of these tracks just need to put gravel traps in obvious passing zones where cars are going to get shoved off, or at least there has to be a choice made between the two drivers who are driving into a corner, that if you go side by side here and you don't give an inch, one of you or none of you are going to come out on the other side of it. That's where the best racing is. I mean, although, of course, you could say, well, you would just get Suzuka 1989 there. And I think that's a good point, but at the end of the day, I want to see the race decided on the racetrack and not in the steward's office. So when you look at the reaction or the choice that Lewis Hamilton made. Ultimately, based on the way the stewards have been calling everything throughout the year, he made the correct decision. He was not defensive going down into that corner. He allowed Max Verstappen to not only get onto the inside of him, but force him wide off of the track because he knew the stewards would side with him and not Verstappen, despite the fact that, in my opinion and a lot of other people's opinion, Verstappen did have the racing line. Verstappen legitimately passed Lewis Hamilton, and Lewis Hamilton was awarded the position back when he cut the chicane. Now, again, it all seems to get quite muddied with the social media surrounding Formula One. Because when you make a statement like that, you think, oh, the guy's anti-Hamilton or he's pro-Verstappen. I woke up this morning fully expecting to see exactly what we did. The ultimate case scenario, everything going right, is that we'd actually get a good race, which we did not. My actual expectation was that Verstappen and Hamilton would take each other out in the first corner. That didn't end up happening, but it sure looked like Verstappen was going to make contact with Lewis Hamilton going down to the hairpin, or at least it had Hamilton been defensive when he was on the outside, they were both going to crash, which of course would have been advantage Verstappen. And I think that's something that we're going to need to talk about a bit later, is that I think the threat of Verstappen causing an accident with Lewis was really one of the key points to this entire race, and ultimately got into the side of the Mercedes-Benz team's heads and caused them to make some choices that otherwise they should have never made. But the first thing I want to talk about, or the next thing I want to talk about, is the fact that Sergio Perez put the Red Bull team on his back. Some of the best teammate driving I've ever seen, and probably some of the best driving throughout this Formula One season. And if not for the F1 Twitter stands standing Kimi Räikkönen and trying to get him driver of the day, which they ultimately were successful for, I think in a legitimate contest, certainly Sergio Perez would earn my driver of the day vote, because being able to hold off Lewis Hamilton, who objectively is the greatest and most successful Formula One driver of all time, on completely used up red tires. You had Hamilton on new hard tires, and the fact that Perez was able to keep him behind him as long as he did, which allowed Verstappen to close back up that gap to Lewis Hamilton, as Verstappen said himself, was absolutely key to Max Verstappen and Red Bull pulling off the World Driving Championship win. That's all I wanted to say about that. Just great driving from Sergio Perez there. We got to talk about race control. So I don't want to belabor a point. Certainly I don't want to say anything unfair about Michael Massey. I know everybody's trying to meme him right now. The one thing I would say is criticize the job and not the person if you're going to do that. I can say Michael Massey has done a bad job without making any kind of personal attacks or personal insults toward him, and I hope everybody is trying to abide by that. That being said, Michael Massey should be fired because he does a bad job at his job. And in fact, I would fire the entire race control at Formula One, because this season has been one of the worst officiated I have ever seen in motorsports, period. And if you have subscribed to this channel, know that I'm one of the people who is very hard on race controls in various series all across the board. But this made me happy with IndyCar's race controlling, and they ultimately cost Will Power a win earlier this year and keep yellow flags out for like 20 laps. But you know what they don't do? Do you know what most race controls don't do? Is make up rules on the spot, and make up rules in which, yeah, great for entertainment purposes perhaps to have Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen be together on the last lap. But when you breach your own sporting code, you hurt the legitimacy of the event. And only waving around the lapped cars that were between Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen, there is a very, very, very legitimate point there that Mercedes has against the FIA and their ruling. Now, would any of those things take a championship away from Max Verstappen? No. But I think if this does go to court, I think that rule breach that Michael Massey and his team made I could see Mercedes being made whole some way through that. Now, I'm not a person who's going to know how the court system works, particularly European courts. But looking at it from a fairness perspective, if you're a Mercedes fan, absolute frickin' lootly, you have a legitimate beef with the FIA on how that was handled, because it was not done to the letter of the law. And had those lap cars been in the way, there's a very strong possibility that Lewis Hamilton would have been able to hold off Max Verstappen on that last lap and claim his 8th record-setting world championship. But ultimately, that's not how it happened. And I want to talk about the final lap, finally, in this video. So the restart was quite interesting because, as we saw in Saudi Arabia, we've seen brake checks and cars running into each other in the past, and even very recently. So I thought it was very interesting that Max Verstappen pulled up alongside of Lewis Hamilton and essentially gave us a Formula One double-file restart. But it was so obvious that Max Verstappen was going to have the tire pace over Lewis Hamilton, and ultimately he passed him fairly easily. And I think this is where Mercedes made their major mistake, and I think it's because Red Bull and Max Verstappen got inside the heads of Mercedes and possibly Lewis Hamilton. And let me explain. As I said earlier in this video, one of the big keys to the end of this season was the fact that going in tied on points, Max Verstappen had all of the tiebreakers. So if both drivers score no points, Max Verstappen wins the championship, which led a lot of people to believe that if Max Verstappen was behind Lewis Hamilton, he would crash him. That is why I believe Mercedes played themselves and had 2 opportunities to pit for fresh tires when Lewis was clearly the fastest driver and clearly had the fastest car on the day, regardless of whether he would have been ahead or behind of Max Verstappen. I believe Lewis Hamilton would have been able to pass and win the world championship, but I think the concern was if Lewis was not in front and a crash happened, Lewis would be blamed for it and not Max Verstappen, and there would be no sort of legal action that Mercedes would be able to take versus Red Bull. That's why I believe that Lewis, when he could have forced the issue quite a bit more on Verstappen on that last lap, he did not, and that was to cover himself legally. That's my opinion. We'll have to see how it all plays out. But I do want to say this as an end result. I felt that Lewis was very, very, very classy. Ultimately, he did not appear publicly anyway to hold anything against Red Bull or Christian Horner or certainly Max Verstappen. He's not hating the player, he's hating the game, and the game is the FIA. And again, I think the real beef here is not between Mercedes and Red Bull, because ultimately they are the players, and those players are playing the game. The game is devised by the FIA, right? And the FIA did not host a legitimate finale to this season. It has cast a black eye on it, in my opinion, and ultimately, in a lot of ways, people are going to question, I think, in some ways, Max Verstappen's first world championship, and we all know that he's likely the heir apparent to Lewis Hamilton, at least in terms of wins and championships in the future. But of course, that didn't hurt Formula One when Michael Schumacher or Ayrton Senna were very controversial figures. So we'll have to wait and see. But those are my thoughts on Formula One. Interesting race, no doubt about it. Perhaps an interesting farce would be an easier way of putting it. I want to give some thoughts right toward the end. You may have noticed these cars sitting here. These are the first 2 wins at the Indianapolis 500 by Al Unser Sr., who died this weekend. And really, I've it's been very sad. Certainly, the first 4-time winner to pass away is very sad. He battled cancer for 17 years, which I was just completely shocked that he was able to do that. I mean, that's an unbelievable achievement of human drive and determination. And Al Unser Sr., what a great champion of the sport. I was watching some races that Al won. on YouTube. Unfortunately, I never met him, though I was able to, and I will cherish this honor for the rest of my life, is that I was one of a few people, thanks to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Museum, who was on the grid for the Indianapolis 500 this year. And I was able to see Al Sr. on the morning of his last Indianapolis 500 that he was able to attend. He was talking to Johnny Rutherford and A.J. Foyt and Mario Andretti, and I'm able to sit here and observe that, and I'll cherish that for the rest of my life. So rest in peace, Al Unser, and obviously my fullest condolences are with the Unser family. So thank you guys so much for watching. This has been David Land on YouTube. Subscribe for more motorsport content, and I will see you in the next video.